If you've ever looked at a delicious, fresh flour tortilla and thought, I'd love to wrap myself or a baby up in that, now's your chance. This tutorial will show you how to make a minky, soft, cozy tortilla blanket like this. Because of the risk of splatters and odor from the dye, I recommend setting up in the garage or outdoors, but you will need access to an electrical outlet. Next, you'll need to get your supplies together. You'll need rubber gloves, paper towels or shop towels, filtered water, a photo example of a tortilla, a hot plate, here are the specs of mine from Walmart, Rit Dye-More for synthetic fabrics, and a stainless steel pot with lid. It's important to note here that any utensils, pots, pans, anything like that you use for this dyeing project cannot be reused for food afterward. Tablespoon brown marker and foam dauber, a really hot blow dryer, and a timer. Here's the circular synthetic blanket I used, made of minky fabric. Mine was for kids, so the diameter was a little bit smaller, and it was 100% polyester. Start boiling your filtered water so that you can prepare the dye. I'll give you exact measurements here in just a second. Using your photo example of a tortilla, spread your blanket out across your work surface so that you can start mapping out where your tortilla spots are going to be. I used a Sharpie for this, and after this process I learned that I would never use a Sharpie again. I would rather use a magic marker which would wash out after the dyeing process. Start in the upper left corner of your tortilla blanket so that you can work from left to right. I recommend tucking away the parts of the blanket that you're not going to be dyeing right away. Give your dye a good shake and then add it to your boiling water with these measurements: 1 tablespoon of dye per quarter cup of boiling water. For the area I was covering, about 10 square feet, I needed about 5 tablespoons of dye for 1 1/4 cups of boiling water. Once you add the dye into the water, stir really well. Just as your dye hits boiling, dip in your foam dauber, then tap off any excess dye. Work in clusters of about 3 to 4 tortilla spots total. You'll see that I make some central spots and then some lighter ones on the outer edges as I make these signature cooked spots for the tortilla look. With 3 to 4 spots dabbed on, turn your burner off and cover the dye with a lid so that it stays warm between bouts of dyeing. With your blow dryer on its hottest setting and holding it only about 1 to 2 inches away from each spot, dry the cluster of 3 to 4 spots in total for about 10 minutes altogether, rotating between each spot for about 10 to 20 seconds apiece. This is where the timer really comes in handy to be sure each spot in the cluster is getting equal dry time. You'll notice through the heat application that this dye doesn't really dry like most other fabric dyes. It kind of hardens and polymerizes as it bonds with the synthetic fabric. I'm using a shop towel here to make sure there's no puddles or pools of dye in the center of the spots. About 2 to 3 minutes before you're done with one cluster of spots, turn your burner back on so the dye returns to boiling when you begin dyeing the next cluster. My kids' blanket needed about 6 clusters of 3 to 4 spots each. Altogether, it took about an hour and a half of dyeing and drying time, or about 6 episodes of Parks and Rec. Here are a couple other tips I picked up from testing out a swatch of the fabric before the real deal. You definitely don't want to use a permanent marker or outline your dye spots, as it looks pretty funny and it doesn't wash out after dyeing. Don't apply too much dye or soak the fabric, especially in the centers of the spots, as it washes right out. And don't skimp on the heat time. When this dye is underheated, it simply washes right out. Heating is the key to fix the dye to the fabric. You do, however, want to dot with the marker where you're going to dye. Tap off the excess dye, apply it evenly. Work in clusters of only 3 or 4 spots at a time. It makes drying a lot easier. Use that timer to ensure that you're hitting each spot for 8 to 12 minutes, and again, watch something good while you're working. You might have noticed that the dye looks pretty dark when it first goes on. As you'll see later on, it washes out to a much more mellow color and looks like a real tortilla, not this really dark brown color you see here. When you're done dyeing and drying, spread out your tortilla blanket and see if there's any additional little detail spots you want to add. As soon as you're done dyeing and drying, you can take your blanket right to a bathtub or a cold outdoor faucet and start some really cold water, ice cold as you can get it. Keep your rubber gloves on as you rinse out the excess dye on each spot. Don't be afraid by what looks like the dye running over the blanket. Because this water is really cold, it's not going to fix the dye to your polyester fabric. Like you saw through the extensive drying process, only heat can really fix the dye like that. Squeeze out the excess water and give your bathtub a nice scrub and rinse. I did not have any issue with the dye staining my bathtub, but I did go over it with a bleach cleaner just to be sure. With your washer set to as cold as you can get the temperature of the water, send the blanket or blankets through for 2 rinses. Once rinsed in the washing machine, flip them on over to the dryer, and this time you're going to dry on hot, hot, hot. This is going to help fix the dye one final time. Dry it in increments of about 20 to 30 minutes, just to be sure there's no melting or overheating occurring. Your blanket might need one final shakeout for any residual lint, but other than that, it should be cozy and ready to go. Wrap up and feel like the most delicious taquito in the world in your new handmade tortilla blanket.
Beautiful going on right there.
Cute.